Welcome back for those that want a bit more on culture. So, what I'm going to do now is just talk a bit about a few technical things, which for those that are kind of interested in a little bit of esoterica. So, if you look at the measurement of culture, um, the vast majority of it are things like Hofstede and um, Schwartz. And what they do is they utilize scale measures, Likert scale measures, so 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 10. So there's that aspect of it. There's also the second aspect of whether we believe individuals are culturally distributed rather than kind of a point on the distribution. Now, this might sound a little bit complicated, but one way to think about it is if you look at, say, something like Hofstede. Hofstede has its dimensions, but on that dimension, if you answer the Hofstede questionnaire, you would be 1 point. Um, so if you come out as highly collectivist, it tells you nothing about the variance of your collectivism. Um, to some degree, the same is true of Schwartz. So what you get is you get a measure of a point for an individual, but you don't really get a distribution for the individual. And I'll come back to that because my view is that it's much better to represent individuals as distributions than to represent them as points. Simply because individuals have variance to the nature of their um, beliefs and attitudes and any of this. It's simply a simplification of the methods that we characterize them as a point in a distribution. The second aspect of this is, are the dimensions of culture the same for everybody? Again, this is another issue which I would worry about, in that if it's true that uh, collectivism and individualism exist, do they exist for everybody? And if they do exist for everybody, is the meaning of what those dimensions are the same for everyone? Now, academically and scientifically, you have to assume that they are the same, because if you assume they're different, then you actually have an enormous confound in your structure, which is everybody believes collectivism is something different, and therefore you can't compare the collectivism of one individual to the collectivism of another individual. Um, to get into this kind of the really kind of nitty gritty kind of academic discussion, there are a number of people who are very strong with believers in what's known as social constructivism, and that is the reality that each individual sees as unique to that individual and is socially constructed. Um, what that implies, of course, is that you can learn nothing by comparing across individuals, or at least learn very little. So you have to have some degree of a belief that those dimensions are the same for everybody, so that when you talk about uncertainty avoidance, that uncertainty avoidance is the same for a Chinese person as it is for an American or a German or a Brit or a Korean. Um, and that is an assumption. That is an assumption. It's not something that's easy to prove in any real way, shape, or form. The other aspect of this is whether culture is your independent variable or your dependent variable. Okay, so you all will have had statistics. If it's an independent variable, then it is a underlying determinant or correlate to something else. In other words, culture is a driver of foreign direct investment. Right? So it's on that side of the equation. If it's a dependent variable, then the issue is what causes culture? What is an underlying predeterminant of culture? And therefore, you might say, well, is um, religion a driver of culture? Well, maybe. Okay, at least in theory, yes, it would be yes. But effectively, culture is the measure you're trying to explain. Whereas when it's an independent variable, you're not trying to explain it. You're assuming that it is an explanator of something else. Now, in 99.9% of studies in international business, it is culture is generally viewed as a dependent, or sorry, an independent variable. Um, Culture drives performance. Culture drives foreign direct investment, um, and on and on. Culture drives trust. Lots and lots and lots and lots of things that for which it might be considered to be that. There are some studies where um, there's an attempt to explain, um, let's say, organizational determinants of collectivism. In that case, it would be a dependent variable, but those are not very common studies. So you have this kind of philosophical and structural way of thinking about culture, that is not necessarily clear, and there are assumptions when you're using different measures of culture. Um, Hofstede, Schwartz. I did not talk about Kogan and Singh, but you will have heard about Kogan and Singh. All of those have assumptions as to the solidity of what's being measured and the validity of the assumption, the underlying measures, the constructs which are there. So you also have a big measurement issues. Okay, now this is something you would probably never have seen in your methodology classes, but most of you will be familiar with surveys. So we'll focus on surveys. Um, so suppose you have a survey. Survey is measured on a 5 point scale, and individuals are sort of kind of asked on that 5 point scale something about religiosity or individualism or whatever it is that they're asked about. One issue is, well, how do people interpret these scales? In other words, if you pick three, what does that really mean? If you pick five, what does that really mean? If you pick one, what does that really mean? And you might sort of say, well, that doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter because if you are picking three, but you don't really quite know why you're picking three or what three means, then the second point becomes quite critical. In other words, is your three the same as my three, or is your three like my four, or is my four the same as your three? All right, and as the scales get bigger, let's say it goes to a 10 point scale, that becomes a bigger issue. So many people actually prefer what are known as discrete choice tasks, in which you give an individual only really one or two choices, yes or no. So you literally make them use a zero or a one. And the reason you do that is because when you say no, that's the same as me saying no. And when you say yes, that's the same as me saying yes. But as soon as I start adding parts to the scale, saying, well, how much of a yes is that on a 10 point scale? And you say eight and I say seven, to what extent are they comparable? And also, I always tell students, PhD students, master students as well, when an individual is ticking three on a scale, what are they cognitively doing? What are they thinking about when they say, "Yeah, three's the right answer for me"? Or if you went back to them 3 months later, would they still tick three? Right? And this is a big, big, big issue, even though people don't necessarily talk about it quite a lot, because it really affects the nature of what it is that you're doing. Um, and because you have what academically are called between subject design structures, which means that what you're doing is you're aggregating across individuals. This interpretation matters. So, what is that number mean to the person who is ticking that number, and is that number that they tick comparable to somebody else ticking exactly that same number? So each of those two things really screw up the validity. Okay. The other aspect of this is related to the incentive compatibility of the scale. Okay. So when when I say something is true, or I say yes, it's five, um, is that really something I'm measuring, or is it something for which I might simply be telling you what it is you want to hear? And and this arises particularly in cases of social response bias. So let's take an example of something like gender uh, openness and say, well, do I believe that um, gay people should have the same rights, or women should have the same rights as men? Okay? Um, I could answer yes to that and it not be true, right? And you know, or I could say, yeah, I'm an undecided voter, but I'm really a strong Trump supporter. I just don't want you to know. And the problem with polling results and scales like this is that they don't really have any incentive compatibility. There's no reason why you should tell the truth. And you've seen this in many areas. In fact, I've done a lot of work in the ethical consumption area. And when you ask people what matters to them, um, they will tell you pretty much everything matters. Okay, they'll tell you third world debt matters. They'll tell you their children's schooling matters. They'll tell you the schooling of their neighbors' children matter. They'll tell you pretty much that everything matters because one, by telling you that stuff matters to them, they look good. But also, you have there's no cost to them for you to lie to you. But if you put those same individuals in what are known as choice tasks, where you force them into conflicts, in other words, you use a different task, where the task more or less says, okay, you've got five things here on the table. You can keep three of them, but two of them you must discard. And when you discard them, they disappear, and you won't see them again. Okay. Or what you do is you put them in market games where they actually have a pot of money and they have to distribute the money. And the way they distribute the money may actually have payoffs to them. Or what you do is you actually look at what it is that they do. You go into a market experiment in which you look at what it is that they do. And when you do that, what you find is you find that the correlation between the stated preference in the survey, in other words, what do they care about, has no correlation to the actual behaviors or the experimental results. And this is a stunning result. Okay. And in psychology, there was a variant of this called the attitude behavior gap. And that is that people would express an attitude in a survey, and then they would look at the behaviors of the individuals with respect to those attitudes and find that there was no relationship or a very weak relationship. And this is what's known as incentive compatibility. What's the incentive that the individual has to tell you the truth? Okay. You must, of course, assume that they have some understanding of what the truth is. But if you use more sophisticated techniques, you can not only determine what they think the truth is, but you can also discover the strength of the belief that that is the truth. So there are ways to do it. It's just extremely difficult to do, and takes a lot of time, money, and effort to actually do it. And this is one of the reasons why so many investigators and so many pollsters and others still use these simple scales, simply because they don't have the time, the money, and the energy to be able to use more sophisticated methods. But they do exist. But these things become even worse when you go across cultures, because it's one thing to sort of say, well, people interpret the scales differently. But when you compare, for example, let's say Japanese to Americans, just as one example, because this has been done, um, you see they use the scales completely differently. In other words, the Japanese rarely, if ever, use the extremes of the scales, which means that if you give them a 10-point scale, they rarely, if ever, use one or two or nine or 10. In fact, they're more likely to always be in the middle. Um, so you have these cultural differences associated with these things. You also find, for example, that if there are unlucky numbers, people tend to avoid the unlucky numbers, which is kind of bizarre, but they actually do that on the scales. So in China, you tend not to use 10-point scales because it's got an 8. Right? Or so that skews your results. So you look at this and you sort of say, okay, I've got to come up with different ways of being able to try to gather this information, but culturally, people are going to do this in a slightly different way. Their tendencies to want to appear to be socially conscious if the surveys have some uh, uh, social content, if you're asking things about child pornography, or asking things about modern slavery, if you're asking things about in the environment and so on down the line, this is a big issue. And in our studies, we actually found that the people who told you didn't care were more truthful than the people who told you that they did care. And our argument for that was that when somebody can tell you something that makes them feel good, or it makes them look good in your eyes, and they tell you the opposite, they're more likely to be telling you the truth. It's easier to say, yes, I care about the environment, than it is to publicly say, I don't care about the environment. And so you have all of these types of things which create exacerbated problems associated with the utilization of these types of things across countries, which means that you have to try to come up with design structures which remove that confounding aspect of the nature of the way you're doing the measurement, and also the way they're interpreting things. So if you were doing a survey and the survey was saying, okay, on this scale of collectivism, how do you rate yourself? If you just use the word collectivism, you create a confound. What you want to do is you want to say, here's a definition of collectivism. Okay, given this definition of collectivism, how does it apply to you? Right? And that's a different way to do it, because if you do it that way, then you're assured that the person's interpretation of the question is going to be the same as somebody else, because you're using very specific language to say, this is what I mean, this is what I don't mean, as opposed to just simply saying, well, how much do you trust another individual? Well, what does trust mean? All right. So, you say, oh, well, on, a scale on uncertainty avoidance, how risk averse are you? You would never ask individuals those questions. For example, to measure risk aversion, you typically give people gambles. And then what you do is you measure how they respond to the gambles. So there are lots and lots and lots of different ways to do this. But when you start going into these cross-cultural comparisons, they become really difficult. There's also a little exercise that you can play, and we'll do a little bit of this in the class. But ask yourself the question: really, what are the underlying cultures that I am representing in some sense, or is embodied within me? And you can start looking at this in slightly different ways, right? You can sort of say, okay, well, what's it made up of? Right? How might it arise? In other words, what might trigger it? Right? So, for example, I might be Italian, and I actually will exacerbate my Italianness, or some aspect of my Italianness, when I'm in an Italian restaurant, or when I'm with other Italians. Right? There are these triggers which will cause an elicitation of those underlying cultural attributes. And then you sort of say, okay, well, how's this revealed in behavior? Where does it show up? Again, I'll use my Italianness example, since it's a little silly. Where does it show up? Does it show up in food choices, automobile choices, clothing choices? Right? My interaction with my wife. You can work your way all the way through this, right? In terms of the nature of, okay, under what circumstances is that going to be revealed? And then also, when is it useful or not useful to me to do it? Under what circumstances is it not useful for me to do it? And this is one of the big criticisms of Hofstede, okay? Because Hofstede's original studies were done within IBM, and therefore the behaviors that individuals would reveal uh, may not be the same inside their workplace as outside their workplace. In other words, why could I, as a boss, appear to be heartless when outside my job, I actually appear to be a much more caring individual? And the answer is I have different incentives in both of those situations. In other words, I have to leave the emotions out at the door in a corporate environment because I've got to treat people in an unbiased and professional manner. Whereas I might and also I'm working on other people's money, right? So there's that aspect as well. Whereas when I go outside the company, I might be completely different individual. Um, how could you explain what appears to be schizophrenia in this circumstances? And the answer is it isn't schizophrenia. Those things are in that same individual. They're just not meaningful in the same way in different circumstances. And other people may sort of kind of use this to elicit kind of aspects of this personality. So in that sense, the culture is a component of the personality, some of which is latent, in the sense is not being revealed in specific behaviors at certain points in time, and some of it's going to be revealed. And the key in some sense is how do you measure the latent components and how do you measure the revealed components of culture? So this is kind of the point about the individual manifestation of culture. Individuals possess latent tendencies on cultural dimensions. And, so I'm going to use a kind of technical term, but the way to think about it is that there actually is a sort of a probability distribution of their degree of density on that cultural dimension. I'll show this in a minute. But we put these together in different ways at different points in time to achieve different outcomes. And these are conditional on lots of things. So, am I making an individual decision? Am I making a joint decision? Am are there pressures around group norms? Is there a price, for example, for me to pay that if I behave in a certain way, that I will be punished? They might be probabilistic in a game theoretic sense, in that I'm playing a game. So what I'm doing is I'm going to heighten certain things in a negotiation to achieve an outcome. So I might play on one aspect of what it is that I would do in different circumstances. All right. I'll give one example of this, and that is that I was once in a quite long negotiation with a group that didn't know that I spoke their language, so we always used interpreters. And at the end, when we finally finished the negotiation, I gave a speech at a dinner in their language, and they bust out laughing, and they gave a speech in English. And it turned out that we both actually spoke the other's language, but we never revealed it. And it was and we were playing a game. We literally were playing a negotiation game in terms of what it was that we were doing. And then there are all sorts of rules and routines and constraints on interactions and behaviors that may come into play. In other words, that the my example in the before of the turning the Chinese students from collectivist to individualist and Americans from individualist to collectivist implied that there certainly is a latent degree of individualism in people in collectivist societies, and there is also a degree of collectivism of individuals in individual societies. And if you alter the structures, then they will behave in different ways. In other words, they have the ability to behave in a different way. They have an understanding of what they're doing when they're behaving in certain types of situations. Um, and you just don't necessarily see it. It remains latent in that regard. And one way to think about this, and I'll just use this as a really kind of silly example, but it's in one of the readings. And it is supposed that we know what the dimensions of culture are, and two of those dimensions are individual collectivism and masculinity and femininity. And the graphs on the top represent the distribution of one person on individualism and collectivism, and the distribution on masculinity and femininity. Now, notice these are distributions. So if you had done a survey and you had answered the questions, what would end up happening is that you would have one dot. There would be a dot somewhere over here, and that would be your measure. There'd be a dot over here, and that would be your measure. But that's not the way we're thinking about it. What we're thinking about is we're thinking about it as a distribution. So this individual here, this person here, if this is collectivism and this is individualism, they're skewed towards individualism, but they have capabilities. They have, you know, collectivist tendencies. And on the masculinity femininity dimension, they're a bit more distributed. Right? But suppose that they find themselves in two different environments. Right? So they get up in the morning and they're at home. And if you look at this, they are, much more likely to reveal their feminine side. But they're also still pretty individualistic, because if you look at the distribution is skewed towards individualism. All right. But this is very wide. They can kind of swing both ways. When they go to work, what happens? They're still pretty individualistic, but they're much more masculine. Right? And if you looked at this and you sort of say, well, suppose that they started here, what's the likelihood they could switch over here? The answer is it's pretty likely, because it's flat distribution. If they were over here, what's the likelihood they could switch over here? The answer is quite low. So the main point of this is that this individual is much more tight around individualism than they are on masculinity and femininity, which means that when we look at their behaviors, we will see them behaving in a more individualistic way most of the time. But sometimes they'll behave collectivistically. But when we look at their own masculinity, femininity, we will see them moving around a lot. And, and this is something that the underlying measures of culture don't really talk about. In fact, they don't talk about it at all. And because they can't really understand the underlying individual manifestations, which means that if a society was highly collectivistic, really are only a couple ways this can be true. One is that a very high percentage of the people must have their distribution on that dimension must look like this, must be more skewed towards collectivist in that situation, right? So it would be the kind of flip side of this. The distribution would be skewed this way, right? So there have to be a lot of people like that. The other aspect of is maybe they actually are more individualistic, but the social constraints just truncate that distribution. In other words, that if you act in an individualistic way, you act out of bounds of the social norms, you get cut off. You get socially ostracized, you get exiled, or you get penalized heavily. And this is one of the reasons why, when you look at, let's say, expatriates or individuals who immigrate, um, and they immigrate, let's say, from a more collectivist society into a more individualistic society, you actually see that those individuals adapt really well. And that must tell you that these individuals probably have individualistic tendencies that are being constrained by the environment in which they find themselves. Right? And the opposite of that is, do you find individuals coming from uh, uh, individualist societies becoming more collectivist? And the answer is you don't generally. And that may also be part of the cultural constraints. In other words, that if the collectivism requires you to look and talk and have life experiences that are the same with other people in the society, and you're an outsider coming in, and you don't speak the language in the same way, you, let's say, don't have the same religion, you don't have the same education, you don't have the same political connections, you don't have the same social connections, then then you appear to be ostracized. But that's not because you don't necessarily have a desire to be more collectivist. It's actually it's all the other constraints which are not allowing that collective tendency to be revealed in your case. And to me, this is a much more realistic way to think about what culture is. And you can talk about this independent of what these dimensions are. What matters is the nature of the distribution and the mechanisms under which it gets revealed. Yeah? Now, you could also talk about another way of doing this. And I suppose you have two people who are interacting, and the two people have to negotiate. And again, I'm just using the same dimensions, but it could be anything. And there's the one person, Kevin, who's negotiating, and this is their distribution. All right. And there's another person, Christina, and this is their distribution. All right. And Christina and Kevin have to interact. And the question, of course, is, well, what might be a fruitful way to interact? All right. Well, if you look at this here, what I do is I take these two distributions and I overlap them. And if you look at this, you have a set of circumstances in which, on the individualism collectivism dimension, right? Um, you can see the overlap of the two distributions, and you can sort of say, well, all right, even though Christina is slightly more collectivist than Kevin, there's a lot of overlap here, and Kevin isn't going to move. Kevin is very individualistic, which means that from the standpoint of interacting, Christina could adapt to his individualism more than he could adapt to her collectivism. And on the other side, if you looked at it, Christina is very feminine, has a high femininity measure, whereas Kevin is pretty dispersed on this, which means that Kevin can adapt to Christina's femininity more readily than she can adapt to his masculinity, which means that in their interactions, for them to kind of be fruitful, you would say, well, she should accommodate his individuality a bit, and he should accommodate her femininity. And that's actually a fruitful interaction between the two of them, let's say from a negotiation standpoint, if they wanted to get to some sort of kind of joint outcome. Um, and this shows how important it is to have this more nuanced view, as opposed to sort of saying, well, Kevin is an American and Christina is, a German or something, and therefore we're going to compare Germans to Americans. No, that's actually not the thing that matters. What matters is not the mean of this distribution; it's the variance of the distribution, and therefore you want to understand the degree to which these individuals have extensive, you know, are really held closely to that viewpoint. So what do you get from thinking about this? One of the things that you get from thinking about this is that the typical ways of measuring things with surveys with Likert scales generally have no meaning. They're not really good at dealing with what it is that we're dealing with. Okay. What you also need to do is to think about, how do I characterize individuals more broadly? How do I get into this more nuanced discussion? And for many of you, understanding the there's a lot of analytics behind this. There's a lot more that you could do with this. The statistics are probably pretty daunting for most people, but that doesn't mean you can't understand the logic of what's behind there, and that is, what are the meaningful dimensions that matter and what are the moments of those distributions? In other words, is it a tight distribution? Is it a diffuse distribution? You're looking not at just a single response, but how might I characterize that individual as a distribution? And even if you don't understand distributions, you can write it. You can write a distribution. It could be, a single point, could be flat, could be uniform, could be bimodal. You can do all sorts of things in terms of thinking about it. It also points out that the situational contexts matter. The situational contexts generate constraints and opportunities. And you can't just assume that because an individual is acting in a certain way in a certain set of circumstances, it isn't the circumstances that are really the driver of what it is that they're doing. That's actually quite critical, because there's a whole area of psychology going back to the 1960s called situational psychology, which puts a lot of emphasis on the situational roles that individuals are in, as the driver of psychological outcomes. And then the last thing is that the models you use. This is a very technical thing. That you can actually use what are known as Bayesian models, and the Bayesian models are very good at looking at individuals. So rather than trying to characterize, clusters of people, you could actually think about talking about every individual as an individual, and thinking about, well, I'm not interested in, you know, Germans or Portuguese or Italians or Chinese or whatever. What I'm interested in is I'm interested in that person, and therefore I'm going to look at that person, and then yeah, if there's similarities between that person and somebody else, then yeah, I could utilize that information, to recognize that these individuals do have very similar backgrounds or very similar characteristics. But the main point of that being is that you start with the individual and you work up. You don't start with the nation and work down. You get very different results thinking about it that way. So with that, that's a kind of a bit of a kind of more nerdy technical way of thinking about things. And hopefully it'll give you a little bit to think about, and a more nuanced kind of view. Um, Also about thinking about culture, but more importantly, also about measuring culture.